Just noble young men that are doing and fighting for us. The vast majority of them raised their hand and said, we're not doing it fast enough. It's been 10 years. They want the Afghanis to step up. So I think asking questions like that will be a role that I can perform in the U.S. Senate to say, not immediately we leave, not immediately we go, not immediately that
we're
everywhere.
You're not looking for a timeline.
I'm looking to ask some questions on what do we do to speed up the process of turning the country back over to the Afghanis.
Now, let me ask you this. Let's talk about Korea for a second, because this is an interesting conundrum. My husband served in the DMZ in Korea, and he's described to me how bizarre it is over there, because the North Koreans are still fighting the war. I mean, they're just, the whole country is just completely brainwashed by Kim Jong-il. But now more problems are fermenting in Korea. What do you do with the base in Korea?
Well, the interesting thing is, North Korea plays sort of nuclear chicken with us. They do it every couple of years. They say, we're going to develop a bomb, or we're going to develop, and they do a missile test. Usually half the time they miss the island they were aiming at. So they are incompetent. And they do this, and then they say, we'll back off of it if you'll feed us, because they're out of food.
Right.
One of the most dramatic photos I've ever seen, and I think somebody had this in their office, was the two Koreas on satellite, or the two Koreas at night, and it shows a satellite photo of South Korea all lit up. You can see it from space. And in North Korea and Pyongyang, looks like one light bulb on. I mean, there's just, their country, socialism fails. North Korea will implode if we quit feeding them and sending them money, and they will get new leadership. We need to encourage that, but not continue to subsidize them and feed them when they run out of money because they're spending all their money on their weapons.
Right. Now, so basically, would you just disengage with the whole North Korean chicken thing? I mean, do you just say enough is enough? Because my real fear is that they are going to sell their weapons systems as they are. They've already exchanged information with Syria. They've already exchanged information with Iran. That's the real concern, not that they're going to be able to come up with something constructive, but they're going to give enough information to somebody else that they're going to have the ability to build a bomb.
I think we need to treat irrational leaders in a way such that we don't always know what they're going to do. So we have to have some sort of strategic ambiguity in exactly what our response will be to them. But I don't think we should be sending them food subsidies or sending them money in any way. I do think if there is a diplomatic way out of this, that it probably involves China, South Korea, Japan, a lot of the regional players, and we should, but it should be pressure on them to try to bring them into and make them part of the world community. But I think they cannot feed themselves, so I don't think their regime can last long if we quit feeding them.
What about the bases in Germany?
It's been 70 years since World War II, and I think that the expense for defending Europe really should be borne by Europeans, and there should probably be changes as to how many troops. A lot of that has occurred. A lot of people don't realize that it's not sort of an all or none thing. We have been removing troops from Germany and various European countries for some time now.
And truthfully, I know that Rammstein is kind of it's a stopping point for wounded soldiers when they leave the Middle East or the areas of action. That's a stopping point where the critically ill go first, or the critically wounded go first. So that serves a very strategic purpose in our current mission.
Right, and I don't think there's any problem with that, and having working relationships with our allies and having joint activities. The question we have to have is, how expensive are these bases? Can we continue to afford them? And is there a way that we can change our policy to have a stronger national defense and not have so expensive of an expanse? Right now we're struggling. We have a $2 trillion debt.
I hadn't heard
$400 billion in interest. So, we do have to think about what our policies are in order to have enough money to defend our country.
When we get back, I've got two questions for you. One is about farm subsidies, because that's a big issue in a rural area like this. And the second is, during the primary, you eschewed and blatantly said, I don't want to take money from the senators who voted for the TARP bill, and yet there was a fundraiser in Washington. A lot of those senators were on the host list. I'd like you to explain that, and we'll talk about farm subsidies, all coming up with Dr. Rand Paul. But first, we're going to get some money news from the Republic Bank and Trust Company Bloomberg Update. 84 WATD WHAS, ripping through a Wednesday edition of the show. In with us, Dr. Rand Paul. Before the break, I threw two things at you. Let's start with the Washington fundraiser first. During the primary, you were basically saying, look, you ran as an outsider. You definitely ran as an outsider and said, I don't want to take money from the people who voted for TARP, and yet last week there's a fundraiser in Washington. Explain that.
Well, I'm still on the outside, but they are talking to me now, and that's a good first step. But the interesting thing is I won my primary race on the number one issue is my opposition to the bank bailout. That doesn't change. I continue to talk about it. No issues on my website change. Absolutely opposed to the bank bailout. What happens is when you win the primary, my message won. So those people now are endorsing my message. And interestingly, I think the Republican Party has become more conservative and more unified against more bailouts since they're out of power.
Well, they're out of power, and they're also actually paying attention, at least, cursory, to what the voters are saying.
Right. And see, the thing is that I still stand up and say, look, when we were in power, we didn't do a very good job. We doubled the debt, and now the Democrats are tripling the debt. So I still say all the same things. I don't pull any punches. But once you win the primary, those people endorse you. The truth of the matter is you will have people who endorse you who are not as conservative as you are, but you still run on your message, and you do have to accept their support because it's how you can win in the fall. Is we need the entire Republican Party, and then I need about 10 to 15% of the conservative Democrats who are going to see Conway as way too liberal for them, and I think that's how we win.
Okay, the big thing, though, is that the hypocrisy label is being thrown at you for that. I mean, how do you say I'm not being a hypocrite when just how do you say you're not a hypocrite?
Well, I think if you change your position, if all of a sudden now I'm for bailouts, that would be hypocrisy, or that would be something that would show that I'm changing my position. My position still is absolute opposition to the bank bailout, absolute opposition to the stimulus package. So my issues haven't changed and remain the same. What I see is now these people who didn't endorse my position in the primary are endorsing my positions for the fall.
Have anyone, and I'm not going to ask for names here, I don't want you to tell tales out of school, but have any Republican senators that did vote for the bailout expressed any kind of regret to you or even had any discussions with you about the position of the bailout?
Some have, and not necessarily with me, but some have actually publicly said in the newspaper they regret their vote on it. Many of them have said, you know what, when it came up, I thought they were just going to buy the troubled assets, but I didn't realize they were going to actually buy the banks. So what I usually respond is I say, you know what, the Republican platform says we don't believe in bailing out businesses, much less owning businesses. So I think a lot of them do regret it, but a lot of them, and I think that's why we need new leaders in Washington who will stand up and won't be afraid. What happened is in the midst of that crisis, everyone was pulling at their hair and saying, if you don't do it, there'll be a calamity. So you need some leaders to stand up and say, no, let's try to let some of these businesses fail through organized bankruptcy, and that it would be better for us and better for the businesses ultimately to go through organized bankruptcy. And that's an organized process. We've had that in our country for a long time. Businesses go to new owners through bankruptcy, and then owners make better decisions on how to make their products and get them to the consumer.
The other thing that's come up as a question is agriculture subsidies. Now, in a rural state like Kentucky, and you're talking about doing away with ag subsidies, that's a very big deal. The practical application of that, if you had the opportunity, if Rand Paul's king for a day, you have the opportunity to do away with the Department of Agriculture, do away with farm subsidies. What does that look like in reality?
Right.
How do you do that, or how do you even move to that?
Well, the interesting thing is they start out with that being my position, and I'm actually much more moderate than that. You know how moderate I am. My moderate position is let's start out by eliminating farm subsidies for dead farmers, okay?
Oh, dead farmers.
I know that sounds radical, but in Miami last year, they did a survey of the farm subsidies, and just in Miami area, they found 234 dead farmers receiving $9.1 million. So let's just agree that we'll get rid of subsidies for dead farmers first. After that, why don't we say that if you make more than $2 million a year in annual income, then maybe you don't need a subsidy.
But then Ted Turner would lose his subsidy for buffalo farming.
2,700 farmers last year who make more than $2 million got subsidies. Let's agree that maybe we could cut them out. There were $13 billion spent on farm subsidies last year. $1 billion was spent telling people or paying people not to grow. So these aren't farmers. If you're not growing anything, you're not a farmer. You know, people in my family have been in the soil bank. The soil bank's been out there for